I used to very assiduously plan talks when I gave retreats when I was a monk on centering prayer and things like that. And I would go to great lengths to kind of plan out, make an outline and do a talk and so on. And after I had this kind of shift that happened to me, I would find that when I wrote out talks and then tried to deliver them, I'd get maybe a few lines out, and then it would suddenly just go in whatever direction it went, and I would be talking about all kinds of things that I hadn't planned to talk about. So one day it just occurred to me, it seems kind of like a waste of time to write down stuff and then get up in front of people and then talk about everything under the sun but what I wrote. So I don't write anything anymore. So if this really falls on its face and it's awful, you know why? Because so far it's gone okay though. I think, really, in a certain sense, you're never going to have before you a more sort of ordinary person than me. I mean, it sounds like I live this kind of, esoteric, sort of exotic life, being a monk for so many years and studying Zen and things like that. But really, I grew up in a very kind of parochial, kind of Midwest town, Columbus, Ohio, and just grew up and was a very religious child and wanted to give my life to God in a certain way. I was in a Catholic context, and so I ended up becoming a monk. And until 8 months ago, I was off in a monastery and living really a very obscure life and a very ordinary life. Like a lot of people kind of imagine monastic life to be these sort of ethereal beings walking around in a kind of state of semi-ecstasy all the time. I can assure you that's not the case. At least if there were ethereal beings like that, I wasn't seeing them. And people in monasteries are just ordinary people like everyone else that run the whole gamut of humanity. You've got grumpy monks and nice monks and young monks and old monks and fat monks and skinny monks and monks who climb on rocks. Remember that song? Fat kids, skinny kids, kids who climb on rocks. I think it was, what was that? Oscar Mayer. So that's why monks are too. They just come in all shapes and sizes. And but one thing that recently I was looking back over things I wrote when I was a child and a teenager. I was very involved. I don't know if some of you may be familiar with the charismatic renewal in the Christian churches of the United States and in Europe also. It was a movement in the 60s and 70s that was a kind of neo-Pentecostal movement that was accompanied by speaking in tongues and healing and visions and all kinds of things. It was kind of a revival movement in the Christian church. And it really crossed all denominational lines. There were Protestants of all stripes, and there were Catholics and even Orthodox, and all kinds of Christians that were getting this, what they call the baptism of the Holy Spirit. And they were, from what I understand, the Hindu thing, when I hear people talk about Shakti, in the descriptions of Shakti Pat, things like that, I think really in Christian language, that would be called the anointing of the Holy Spirit. And something that kind of amazes me and sort of intrigues me and interests me is all the parallels I see in all the different spiritual paths. You've got different language, you've got different descriptions, different theologies or philosophies, but when you boil it down to its essential kind of essence, essential essence is a little redundant, but to its essence, you get really descriptions that seem to be describing very similar things. And I know that when I look back over my childhood and I was looking at journals I'd written, I was very kind of introspective and wrote a lot of journals. And I wrote in the backs, I had big journals like, this thick, just filled with stuff from between the ages of, I'd say, 12 and 18 or so. I had a very strong experience in this charismatic renewal of Jesus, of a real experience, a devotional kind of life where I felt very close to Jesus. And I felt like I wanted to emulate Jesus in my life, that what would Jesus do kind of thing. And maybe that's a little immature in some ways, but for me it was a very much had a strong devotional quality, and I wanted to be like Jesus. And I saw that in a lot of things I wrote. A lot of the things I wrote in these journals and poems I would find and put in there. And there were a lot of them were about somehow being like Jesus and experiencing the presence of God and being able to somehow, in some manner, radiate the presence of God in the world. And I knew people who did that. I met people who seemed to have that quality. And I remember sitting in a Christian concert one time and listening to a man sing named Phil Keaggy. And I really admired him. He was a great guitarist for one thing, and I played guitar, and I aspired to be a great guitarist. I never made it, but I tried. And anyway, I really liked him, and I went because he was such a good guitarist. But he sang this song called "The Mark of a Christian," and I'll never forget it. I still remember the song, and I remember several months ago, I was reading in my journals when I was a teenager, and I'd written down this song, word for word, and it kind of, the essence of the song was to be like Jesus, to radiate the joy, the presence, the love of Jesus, of what I perceived that would be like. And this poem that Phil Keaggy set to music, they made a song, it's called "The Mark of a Christian." I'd just like to share it with you. It goes like this, very simple. Not only in the words you say, not only in your deeds confess, but in the most unconscious way is Christ expressed. Is it a beatific smile? The holy light upon your brow? Oh no, I felt his presence when you laughed just now. To me 'twas not the truth you taught, to you so clear, to me still dim. But when you came to me, you brought a sense of him. And from your eyes he beckons me, and from your lips his love is shed, till I lose sight of you and see the Christ instead. You know, I didn't write that, but it's a very beautiful song, and he sang that, and I felt, when he sang it, I felt that presence of Christ. I felt that joy. I felt that sense of peace and love. And you know, that was so moving to me. At the age of 14, I remember sitting in that concert, feeling that sense of presence. And in my life, many times, it seemed that presence would constantly come and go. You know, in that charismatic renewal, we'd have these worship sessions that would last for hours, and people would do this thing they called singing in tongues. I don't know if you ever heard about glossolalia, which is this phenomenon of speaking in tongues. Well, people would just kind of do spontaneous sort of melodies and sing. It would all blend together. And if you had hundreds of people, it was quite beautiful, this sort of just cacophony of various sounds like different languages and this beautiful kind of sound. And I would have these experiences, and I would be in some worship service like that, or I'd see people healed. I've experienced a lot of amazing things in that movement, and I would always have this sense of God's presence being there and being very, very real. Then it would fade, you know, and then it would come back again, and it would fade. And I felt this sense of God's presence coming and going constantly. And then so I was on this search for God's presence. It was like, that seemed to me to really have an experience of God's presence and to radiate that presence in the world was what I really longed to do with all my heart. You know, that was what really felt like the purpose of human life was for. To be a channel of God's presence, to radiate God's presence, to be Christ-like, to be that kind of presence in the world. And that's, I think, what really led me to want to be a monk, to enter the monastery. I read about St. Francis of Assisi, who I got my name from, and he was like that. He was often called, in the hagiography, in the various accounts of his life, he was called another Christ, very, very Christ-like, very much like Jesus, and had that gentle, kind of loving, peaceful presence and quality that just touched people wherever he went. And I wanted to be like that. And so that's what motivated me to become a monk. Really, it was that search for the presence of God. And you know, most of us in life, what I've discovered, I've talked to a lot of people when I was a monk, and since I left the monastery, even maybe more. And I've talked to an awful lot of people. And if you're like most people on the planet, you're probably looking for something. You know, I think most people seem to be looking for something. And some people have an idea of what that is, and some people don't have an idea of what that is. And it takes all kinds of forms, this search. And many of you I know have been very serious spiritual practitioners and meditators and people on a spiritual search. But there's just as many people in the world that are out there searching for fulfillment and happiness and love and peace and all those things in various objects and money and relationships and all these things. And even those of us that are on a spiritual search, to a certain extent, think, let's just be honest here, think that we're going to find that the way most people do, in relationships and money and all those things. A lot of us never quite give that up. Some of us do, you know. I mean, going to a monastery, the chances of me becoming rich or successful or marrying a beautiful woman are greatly reduced. It's hard to meet women in monasteries. And it's hard to make much money. But I think really, essentially, what we're all searching for is this presence of God, isn't it? Yes. You know, there's something in us that realizes that we want to be happy. But we don't only want to just be happy, we want perfect happiness. We want happiness without a shade of sadness in it. If we're really honest, don't we? You know, we spend our whole lives going from one thing to another, whether it's spiritual things or physical things or relationships or jobs or whatever. You know, looking for that perfect fulfillment. And it seems that we just never find it, you know. We look here, we look there. And one day, when I was in the monastery at Mass, and this is after a number of years of spiritual seeking, so I'd had a few different experiences of God's presence, of a sense of peace. I'd studied with Zen masters. I did Vipassana very seriously. I had some, you know, breakthroughs here and there on retreats, things like that. But whenever I'd get to this sense of presence, it would always seem to recede again into the background. You know, it would be there for a while. Maybe it'd even be there for a week or a month or something, you know, be there for a while. But it always would go away again. And after a while, I got to a point where I thought, maybe that's just the nature of it. You know, maybe it just comes and goes. We can't really have a constant experience of that. Maybe it's not possible. Maybe this goal I've had all my life is kind of illusory, you know. You get a little older, you start losing your optimism, you know, after years and years of all kinds of spiritual practices and disciplines and things. And yet this presence would still come and go. And then one day in church, during the service, there was a sense of the presence, came back. And even years before, in Zen, I'd had a sense of being in the present moment. I remember a kind of breakthrough back in the 80s when I'd studied with a Korean Zen master, and I had this kind of breakthrough where I saw that the present moment is actually the presence of God. That if you can live consciously in the present moment, what you come to realize is that that is the presence of God. Here and now, that God is eternally present here and now. And I had that insight, but again, it receded. So it came and went. Then this day in church in 2010, in March, in Montreal, I can even take you to the spot, point to it. So here's where it happened. And what happened was, I had a sense of that presence again. And I was very aware of it. It was now, it was here, in the present moment, just like it is now. And what I suddenly saw so clearly was that my own simple sense of existence in this moment, here and now, which is always here, right? You always exist until you don't, at least in the body. But your experience, your constant experience, and mine and everyone's, is that we exist. We're here. We're conscious. We're present. It's no big mysterious thing, no esoteric thing. It's just our simple presence, here and now. What became crystal clear to me that day in church was that is not different than the presence of God. There's no difference. There's not two presences. There's not a billion presences in the world with all these people and animals and various things. But that there's one presence that permeates all that is. And that my own simple presence, Francis, here and now, that simple sense of presence, even beyond the Francis part, but just being present, even before you call it anything, even before you call it a man or a woman or whatever, just that simple sense of presence, that simple sense of beingness, is in fact the presence of God. And seeing that so clearly really just transformed everything. After that, in that moment, and after that, everywhere I looked, everywhere I was filled with the presence of God. I came to realize that the presence of God is omnipresent. It's present everywhere. And it's present in me, and my presence, in your presence, is the presence of God. And the realization of that, you can imagine, just imagine. To really understand that the presence of God is always present, always has been, always will be, eternally present, here and now. And that the essence of that presence is perfect happiness, which in some spiritual circles we call bliss, Ananda. The Hindu name for God is Sat Chit Ananda, being, consciousness, bliss. That the joy and bliss and perfect happiness of God's presence is essential to the reality that we call God, or the absolute, or whatever name you want to slap on it. And that it is always, always available to us. Discovering that reality is the secret to human happiness. That perfect happiness we've been seeking all along, the reason we couldn't find it is because we are it. It's like looking all around the house for your glasses when they're up on your head, or on a chain around your neck. So that's all I have to share. No big deal. I'm no Vedic scholar. I know a good deal about Christian mysticism. I don't know a lot about Vedic philosophy. But I know this is true because I experience it every moment, eternally now. And once we wake up to that reality of Christ being present and radiating through a human life and really embodying that has become a reality in my life now. I really see and experience that presence, and that presence flows through this human life. And it's nothing about me. I'm not anything special at all. I'm just like all the rest of you. And that presence is in all of you. It's not a matter of I just woke up to the fact that it was present in me. In waking up to the fact that it was present in me, I also woke up to the fact that it's present in you, and you, and you, and you, and everyone, and everything. Do you have something?
An awareness that I have that goes in step with what you're saying is that the biggest barrier to that being in touch with the universal presence is intellectual activity. We're talking about being as opposed to thinking. And it's the use of meditation, which is going to a state of being, is such a wonderful tool to get back to that place.
Definitely. I would totally agree with that. I mean, that's the basic prescription, I think, to get back to that place that we've actually never left, but to be conscious of it.
But we frequently cover it over with intellectual process, emotional intellectual process.
Sure, yeah. And that is the value of spiritual practice, and all the major spiritual practices that really are authentic spiritual practices and really work for people are all about just quieting the thinking faculty. I shy away from the use of the term mind because I think, and I get into trouble with this statement I'm about to make, but I'm going to risk it. There isn't any mind. Surprise! We talk about mind, but in reality, I think what we do is we bundle together this conceptual idea of mind. We bundle together all the thoughts. There's certainly a thinking function. You know, the brain thinks, there's a thinking function there. Thoughts arise, who knows from where. They seem pretty random sometimes, don't they? You know, I don't know about you, but you know, at least I used to have all kinds of thoughts arising, just bizarre thoughts. Thoughts I would never follow through on, but you know, and you think, where in the world did that come from? You know, a thought would pop into your head. But yeah, I mean, after years of spiritual practice, in quieting that faculty of thinking, this reality seemed to step forward, seemed to come forth. And I think that's really the way it works, and it's really quite simple. It's not rocket science. You know, I'm not against philosophy and theology and all that. I have a degree in philosophy, actually, Western philosophy. I don't remember half of it now. You know, there's something to be said for the intellect, and we can use it, and we can learn things, and we can learn languages, and all kinds of things that are nice. But it's not going to take us to this presence. It's not about that. When I say there's no mind, all I mean is there's no entity called the mind. We have this idea, I think, many of us, if we're really honest, we have this concept of the mind, and it's some kind of entity that sort of floats around in our head or something, or somewhere in proximity, you know. And it's like an entity, and we talk about our mind as if it's some real being of some kind. And it's like, no, it's a faculty, thinking faculty. And I think as human beings, we actually come to use that tool an awful lot more than we need to, and we use it for everything. You know, it's like if you had a hammer and you used the hammer for everything. You know, if you were trying to eat with a hammer, and, you know, use a hammer to wash your clothes with, and use a hammer to, you know, make food with, might be kind of limiting, wouldn't it? And it might be kind of frustrating, and you wouldn't probably get a lot of things done very effectively. And yet that's what we do with the thinking faculty. We think it's going to take us to God. We think it's going to help us know what we need to do in life, how we're going to be successful, all these things. And I'm pretty convinced that that's kind of not the way it works, generally. The mind is a very good tool, the thinking faculty that we call the mind. It's a good tool, and we can use it for certain things. But I think we use it a lot more than we probably need. And it's tiring. You know, when I had this happen to me, my mind kind of basically turned off for 6 months or so. It was really it went on vacation. It wasn't there. And yet, things happen. You know, I was visiting the sick and dying. I was doing all kinds of things. Doing the divine office as a monk, doing my spiritual reading, all my practices and things I did. Well, the practices kind of fell away a bit, but there was a lot of stuff still going on, But there was hardly any thinking about it. It just kind of flowed through me. Life just kind of lived me, and I let it live me, and I was conscious of it doing that, but there wasn't a lot of pre-planning anymore. And it went just fine. In fact, it went better. And so, and then after 6 months or so, it seemed like the mind kind of returned, but it was different then. The relationship to thinking was a lot different. It was no longer like thoughts were who I was, I didn't take them so seriously. They were just thoughts, like clouds in the sky, coming and going, and like, oh, that's a neat one, that's interesting, whatever. But it didn't really grab you anymore. Even for me, this is a very simple talk, but this is what's coming soon. Yeah.
Now, do you still have occasionally what you called earlier bizarre thoughts, or not? Or all thoughts now purposeful and life-supporting?
Oh, I mean, occasionally there's some little weird thought, but not too often. I mean, most of the time now, the experience is that if thought's needed, it's there. It shows up, and I can use it if I have to, like, do my income tax, which I never did before, so that was an interesting experience. The thought-thinking faculty is fully functional still, but I think I would say the difference is it's no longer who I take myself to be, it's just a faculty. Like the faculty of breathing, do you take yourself to be your breath? You kind of are your breath in a way, you could say, but it's, you know what I mean? I think we personify this faculty and make it into an entity. I mean, some people call it the ego, you could call it whatever you want, mind, ego, But in reality, what are we really? Think about that a little. Just consider that, All that we really are in our own direct experience is presence, here and now. In this very moment. We're nothing more than that, nothing less than that. We exist. That's that being aspect of Satchidananda. Being. That's who we really are, on the deepest level. All the other stuff that we think we are, our past experiences, all that, what is that? Is that it's concepts, isn't it? It's a conceptual sort of structure that we build and then we take to be reality. But our own direct, real experience is simple presence, here and now, eternally, here and now. Yeah.
One awareness that I have developed is that if I lose that sense of bliss, that sense of presence with the universal presence, all I have to do is switch to my mantra, to whatever I use, and just drop that intellectualization. And I go back to that presence. That universal presence is who we are. We're just a manifestation of it.
So I'd like to hear more about your correlating the Christian paradigm with the awakening experience. Specifically as how you perceive Christ. Like Maharishi said that Christ actually taught people to transcend, to meditate, but we don't seem to have that, certainly in the exoteric Christianity. I don't know if there's some hidden knowledge that you may have been exposed to.
Well, I think that this basic idea that what we are is presence. If you want to boil down the teaching to one phrase, I would boil it down to that phrase. What and who we are is presence here and now. That's very, very simple. We make it very philosophical and complicated, but I think in reality it's really quite simple. And once a person has a direct experience of that, they see how simple it is. And they also see it everywhere they look. Like now when I read the Gospels, I read even St. Paul, and I feel that a lot of this is found in there. if you know, once you see it where you didn't see it before. And it's there in mystical Christianity, it's there in Hinduism, it's there in Islam in different strands, it's there in Buddhism. It's, you know, it's really, this basic insight can be seen in all the major spiritual traditions of the world. They just are using different words, different terminology, different ways of explaining it. I mean, specifically, if you want, like, from the teaching of Christ, I think there are many, many things that point to this. But my own sense is that really what I've come to now is that Christ really was an awakened being who had a real experience of this in his own direct experience. And a lot of the ideas that Christianity developed about the Christ, I think from Christ's perspective, what he was trying to say to people, I would suspect, is well, he did say, I and the Father are one, or I and the absolute reality are one. And so are you, and so are you, and so are you. I don't think he was making any claims to be some exclusively divine being. But what he was saying is, yes, I am a divine being. I am the only begotten Son, eternally begotten of this Father, and so are you. That's what we all are. I think like all enlightened beings, he was pointing to that. He had a direct experience of it, but he wasn't claiming exclusive possession of that, in my opinion. I mean, traditional Christian theology would take issue with me on that.
Sure.
But when after the experience that I had, after the sense that I had, when I go back and I read the documents that are attributed to the various words that are attributed to Christ, and they're not only in canonical Gospels, but there's a kind of plethora of Gnostic Gospels and things that are very early also. And I think if we want to get back to what were the original teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, we have to take all the documents we have and look at them and try to glean from that what he was very likely said. That's not always easy to do so many years after, but that's, I think, what we attempt to do. But when you read all that stuff in the light of awakening, it takes on a very different feel. And things that you thought you knew, like, just for instance, there's one scripture I know of that says, that's often quoted by fundamentalist Christians, and it's often sort of touted as the scripture that sort of proves that Christ is the only way, and if you don't believe explicitly in Christ, you're sunk, basically.
Right.
And it's, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. And what I do a lot of times is just shift a little bit, change a few words of that to give this new sense that I get now from my reading of it. And I would say with that scripture I've done that with the simple word I am. Or the simple word the, if you want to even say that. The I am. The I am, the presence in you and me and all of us. The I am that just exists right now, here and now in this moment. The I am is the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the absolute reality of God, which he called the Father, except through the I am. So in order to come to a realization of the absolute, we have to touch into that I am, that sense of existence, that sense of beingness, that always exists in all of us. And we have to touch it. That's the only way to the realization of the absolute, is our own sense of being here and now. And then eventually, if we keep touching into that, we keep coming back to a sense of the eternal presence of that, eventually we get it. Eventually what happened to me happens, and we see, oh, that simple sense of presence that I am, that's not separate from God's presence. It's the same presence. Yeah.
So it's not at all religious. This is not a religious experience. You came up in a Catholic church with a religious guy, but I think it's possible it could occur for someone outside of Orthodox religion, any kind of Orthodoxy.
Oh, surely.
often.
You might want to repeat the question if everybody can.
Well, just that it's not dependent on a religious life in any way.
No, I don't think so.
Spiritual. I mean, we could say it has a spiritual context, but it's not
Yeah.
Christ-based or.
No. I'm using
I
the
know.
symbolism and the kind of metaphor of Christ,
Yeah.
because that's the symbol and metaphor that I related to in my life and in my spiritual path. But you could talk about the Buddha nature. You could talk about just simple presence. But Eckhart Tolle talks about presence and being and doesn't put it in any religious context whatsoever. However, I will say this. I really think probably the majority of people would do well to plug into a religious tradition of some kind, find a teacher who's competent and clear and has had realization themselves, self-realization, and then put themselves under that discipline and really go as deeply as they can into that. And that, I think, for the vast majority of people, is the most direct way to get there. Because,
A religious teacher, you said specifically.
not necessarily a religious teacher, but a tradition, a spiritual path with a teacher. You know, I think most people are kind of in the quagmire of human conditioning enough and have enough blind spots that it's very helpful to have someone who has navigated that territory themselves, and that they can kind of be a guide and they can help you. I'm not necessarily talking about total gurudom or something where you put somebody up on the throne and all that. Well, that happens too. But more a matter of having somebody who can guide you, who knows the territory. Like if you go somewhere on a journey, it's good to have a map, you know? It's good to have a kind of a sense of how to get to the end of your journey. And a lot of people claim, oh, I'm spiritual but not religious, and I don't need any tradition, I don't need a teacher, I can just do this on my own. It's like, well, good luck. I don't find that usually works for most people. I've talked to an awful lot of people about their spiritual life, and a lot of people who have that approach end up stuck in some mud puddle somewhere, not knowing how to get out. And that's just the fact of it. And at least that's my opinion. And you can take or leave. But my sense is that, yeah, it's not dependent on any one religious tradition. I think all the major religious traditions have this teaching of awakening, of presence. It's there. I mean, if you look for it, it's there in all the major traditions. And they all have various ways of approaching it, talking about it, various practices. But I think essentially, if you boil them all down, they're all pointing to this same basic reality that the presence is within all of us. And we just need to wake up, open our eyes, and see it, and experience it. Yeah.
I'd like to go back to first principles. And as you talk about the desire to be in the presence of God, as a recovering atheist, I would ask to define for me who or what the God is. I don't think you're talking about Zeus or Vishnu. You're talking about the laws of nature. Whose presence is it you're yearning for found?
Yeah, that's not a logical kind of conceptual thing that I can neatly define and give to you. I mean, I think in my sense, in my kind of psyche, in the way I was as a child and how I grew up and all that, I took the sense of God's presence and the existence of God, for example, I just sort of took for granted. I never really doubted that. For me, it was like always pretty apparent that there was a God somewhere. Now, I intuitively had a sense that being in union with that reality was the whole purpose of life. But to define it, I mean, you can do that theologically and stuff. I'm not sure it's really all that useful, but I mean, you can do that in various ways. I guess now, in my own direct experience, what I'd say is that what I've come to see and experience and really know, it's not a belief, it's not a kind of concept or an abstract idea, but what I know in my own direct experience is that this simple sense of presence that I'm experiencing right now, sitting in this chair, in this room, in Fairfield, Iowa, at 10 till 8, you know, which is just an idea, 10 till 8. But right here and now, that presence that's just aware of existing right here and now is the presence of God. What I came to see in that moment was that my own simple presence is divine, is sacred, is holy. And I guess that's intuitive. I mean, you know, if you're asking for some kind of a conceptual description of what God is or definition, no, I can't give you that. I can kind of be that here, and I am that, and so I think that in a way, I don't mean to sound arrogant, but that kind of speaks for itself. Like when you are living in the consciousness of this presence, it's fairly obvious, I think, to people who you encounter. There's something. It's like that poem I recite at the beginning. Not only in the words you say, not only in your deeds confess, but in the most unconscious way is this Christ presence, this God presence, manifesting as a human being, let's say, is felt, is intuited, is kind of known, it's recognized. And the reason we recognize it in others is because that's who we are too. You know, when we see someone who is really consciously manifesting that sense of presence, they've come to see that that's who they are, and they don't lose sight of that. And it's always radiating in their life. When we encounter someone like that, we recognize that because we recognize ourselves in them. It's like a mirror. It's like seeing yourself in a mirror. And you go, oh, that's it.
It sounds to me that you're talking about someone who's been through years of psychoanalysis, maybe that's a spiritual path, and come to have a sense of himself or herself.
Okay. I mean, yeah, I think psychoanalysis could be a spiritual path. I do not have any way of limiting what's a spiritual path for one person or another. You know, we all have our paths. And I think it's like all paths lead to Rome, that old idea. I think they all lead to this sense of presence. And you can call it Christ, you can call it Buddha nature, you can call it nothing at all. You don't have to call it anything. It's not important really what you call it. It's important to be that. It's important to manifest that, to live that, to radiate that, to embody that. And I think that's what the Christian sort of teaching of the incarnation, it's kind of pointing to that idea. And since this happened to me, I see that in all kinds of traditional Christian terminology and things. Like I know the creed. There's one part of the creed that talks about Christ. And now when I hear that, I often think, oh, that's true of everyone. And I can recite it for you. It says, I believe in one Lord Jesus Christ, the only Son of God. Well, we are all the only Son of God. We're all one child of God. I believe in one Lord Jesus Christ, the only Son of God, eternally begotten of the Father. You know, born eternally here and now. Constantly renewed, the reality of that. It's not something that is static, it's a dynamic living reality here and now, in this eternal now of God. Eternally begotten of the Father. This is a beautiful, I love it, it's so poetic. God from God. Light from light. True God from true God. Begotten, not made, one in being with the Father. You know, my sense is that that's true of every person in this room on the most profound level. And when we wake up to that, when we see that in our own experience, when we see that directly, our whole sense of life, of who we are, of how we live, all you can imagine the ramifications of this. Yeah, I'm sorry. It's just
One of
because
the-
other people.
one of the things that I have experienced is the connectedness with the universal presence through the traditions, the ceremonial traditions of the Native American spiritual culture. And the fact that with the chanting, with the drumming, with the dancing, etc., we lose the intellectual side of it. It goes away, and we become connected with that universal presence. If you look at every culture, there is an element of this present.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And whether it's Gregorian chant or whatever, and it is that accepting of this universal presence that we're all a part of, and being comfortable not to intellectualize it.
Well, and I think it's one of those things that you can't force this. Like you can do practices. Rick Archer, who you all know and love, says a lot of times on his show, what is the phrase now? It went out of my mind.
What line?
It doesn't exist.
I don't know what you're referring to.
No. Oh well, if it comes back to me, I'll share it. Sorry about that. Yeah.
Well, that gets sort of to, so what's the, I mean, it's just a matter of grace. I mean, that all of a sudden.
Oh, I found what it was Rick said. It relates to that by being a matter of grace. He says something about where spiritual practices do not lead. No, enlightenment is an accident. Spiritual practice, what is it?
Enlightenment may be an accident, but spiritual practices make you accident prone.
Yeah. Enlightenment may be an accident, but spiritual practices make you accident prone.
I didn't originate that.
Yeah, I know. Somebody else came up with it, but he says that a lot. And I think it's true that, spiritual practices can help make us accident prone to fall into the grace of enlightenment. But we can't force it. It's like, it happens when it happens. It's like a little kid trying to force themselves to be 6 foot tall. I remember when I was little, I wanted to be 6 foot tall. And that my parents used to measure us up on the door, and we have all these little marks. And if you go to that house, you'll see these marks when they were 5 and when they were a twin. So we were, and I was a little taller than my brother after a while, which he hated. But we would measure ourselves, and if you go back, you'll see these through the years, 5 years old, 8 years old, 9 years old. And I was always wanting to be 6 foot. And I actually never made it. I'm 5'11" and 3/4. So not quite 6 foot. But, as much as I wanted to be 6 foot, I couldn't make myself be 6 foot. I couldn't make myself even be close to 6 foot. I got to be 6 foot when I was good and ready to be 6 foot. And until then, I wasn't. And it's like this, once you see it with such clarity, you see it, in such a way that you can't unsee it, and you think, how could I have not seen this before? It's like that old commercial, I should have had a V8. You can't get over that you didn't see this. It's always been here. It's just like your own existence, You exist. You're here right now. You have a sense of presence. You're sitting in a chair listening to this funny guy from Ohio talk. And you're having the sensory experience of stuff coming through your ears, through your vision, all that. And you don't doubt that you're present, do you? You don't have a sense of your presence coming and going. No, you're always present. So that's just the way this is. When you realize that there's no difference between that presence and God's presence, then this sacred presence that we think of as such a special thing that just comes every now and then, or maybe never came. I've talked to a lot of people, I've never had an experience of the presence of God. And I think, oh yes, you have. You just don't know it. But your own presence, you've certainly had an experience of the presence of God, because that is the presence of God. But you either see that or you don't. There's no way to make someone see that, but I often say, this is caught, not taught. I think the primary way this realization is transmitted from person to person is the same way a flu is. In a certain sense. It's like when you're around someone who's got the virus, you tend to get the virus. So if you know someone who's got this virus, this God virus, hang out with that person. Spend as much time with that person as you can, and eventually you'll catch it. And it doesn't really matter what the person says that much. I mean, we say what we say. Words are like they're there, you know, they carry this in a certain way. They're pointers, they kind of point, but they point very poorly, don't they? I mean, words are not really adequate. This is a reality that's absolutely beyond words. So words can only kind of incline us. But I'm absolutely convinced, that the way that this is transmitted, the way people get this, is by that simple sense of presence that they sense in the person. When a person awakens to this presence, that that's who they really are, then this presence is consciously emanating from that person all the time. And there's a kind of energetic quality to that people just get. They recognize it when they see it. It's like kind of like that idea, you know it when you see it, you know? And the reason you know it is because that's who you are too.
Traditions, traditions that have a teacher in a traditional transmission of such knowledge, they usually have provisions for verification, like in Zen, an income that the teacher would give. Did you feel any need for such a verification? Or did you get one?
Yeah, I mean, I actually did feel a need to seek people out who had had this happen to them. And it was a grace in my life that I was able to find them. And I did find them. I didn't get a traditional transmission from a teacher like that, but it was very clear to me that this sense of presence that I was now experiencing myself as was being recognized by people, and people who had had the experience themselves. So I think that there is a validity to that kind of thing, and there's a kind of natural tendency among people when they've had an awakening that they want to kind of seek out others who have awakened and get a kind of verification. Although there's really, I mean, the one essential kind of aspect of this kind of thing is that there's no possibility of doubt, really. I mean, you know, it's just as clear as the nose on your face. It's like once you see this so clearly, and you realize that this is who you really are, it's like, can you doubt that you're a human being? You know, can you suddenly think, oh, I'm a human being, I gotta hold on to that. I'm not a giraffe, I'm not a dog, I'm a human being, I've got it, and I gotta get this verified, I gotta find somebody else. No, you're a giraffe. Oh my God, I was wrong. It's not like that. Although I'm not making fun of the verification, because like I say, there is a tendency in you for some odd reason. You even though you don't really doubt it, you want to run into other folks who have had the same thing, and you do. I mean, I think you do. You find it. It's a grace maybe, but people show up. People come across your path, and they are able to say, yeah, you're definitely, this is what's happening. Because they know they've had it happen to them, and they know. Now, I will say some of those traditions and things, you know, like all religious tradition, and if there's anybody who has a kind of sense of religious tradition, it's me. I mean, I lived in a very strict religious tradition, and we had a lot of various rituals and things like that. And even though those rituals and all that point to a reality, they can often just become rituals, can't they? I mean, a lot of times this kind of transmission and Dharma transmission, things like that, aren't necessarily all, in every case, living transmissions of the Dharma or enlightenment or whatever. I mean, that's certainly what they're meant to point to, but, you know, like any religious tradition, and a lot of us in the West, we look at our own religious traditions, we say, oh, that's dead, you know, Christianity, Judaism, it's dead ritual. But, you know, Hinduism and Buddhism, now that's living. Well, you go to a Buddhist or Hindu country, and you'll find just as many nominal Hindus and Buddhists as you do nominal Jews and Christians who just go to temple because their parents did, and they don't really have an interest in, they don't have a burning spiritual desire. That, you know, it's religion is religion is religion. You know, so it's got some valid points to it. It's pointing to something. A lot of times there's authentic, real, direct experience there, and unfortunately, sometimes there's not. So there's no guarantee, you know, is what I'm saying. I think you could go through all the rituals and ceremonies and receive all the transmissions under the sun, and that's not to say that you will actually be receiving the spiritual reality of that necessarily. There's nothing automatic about it. I don't think rituals and things like that. Does that make sense? Just kind of as a response.
Sure.
Yeah.
Wondering how you regard death.
How I regard death. Well, I was a hospice chaplain for a long time. So I would say my, even pre-sort of awakening, if you want to put it that way, my sense of death was probably a lot different than most other people's, because I was working with death all the time. So I kind of came even in that sense, even kind of on a natural level, before there was any big shift spiritually. There have been little shifts though over the years, many little shifts. So, but my sense of death was that it was a transition from one level of reality to another. You know, that it was, and that it was a normal part of life, that it was just what happens, you know. And now my sense is that on one level, on the deepest level, this sense of presence, on that level, there is no death. There's no birth, there's no death. There's no old age, sickness, or death. You know, but on the level of the body, in this physical reality, this material world, there's certainly death. I mean, and it's not just a human death, but animals, trees, grass, this building, you know, it all, the very nature of physical reality is that it arises, it's there for a while, it's constantly changing, constantly dissolving, and then it dissolves and it's gone, and then something else comes up, and that's kind of the nature of it. So I guess the way I look at death is that it's kind of the normal development of life. You know, it's the inevitable sort of conclusion of physical reality. It can't last forever, so it takes some other form. Does that answer your question, or?
Well, I suppose so. I also wonder how you think of animals.
How I think of what?
Animals and plants. Are they similarly part of the presence?
Are they what?
Part of the presence.
Part of the presence?
Oh, sure. Everything is. I mean, everything that exists in that presence. Everything that arises and ceases in that. So it's part of that. It's included in that. That's why sometimes you get into some non-dual circles and people make this big distinction between absolute and relative. Absolute is real and relative is unreal and totally illusory and all that. And it's like, from my perspective, anything that arises in that infinite, vast presence. So therefore, it's part of that. It's like a manifestation of that, you could say. So surely animals and plants and trees and rocks and rugs and walls and mirrors and drums and chairs and cameras and microphones. Everything is in that presence. It can't exist otherwise. It's like there's a Christian scripture that says, in Him, God, the absolute reality, we live and move and have our being. That everything that has being in the ground of all being, which is this absolute reality that we call God sometimes. I'm no more really that attached to the word God. I mean, I use the word God a lot, but just because I'm used to it. But God's a word. This reality is way beyond any word. So if you don't like the word God, then just don't use it. You know? This reality won't mind. It won't be offended.
interesting, Native American and many primordial spiritual processes have an awareness of a universal spirit, the Great Spirit, and that we are all part of that Great Spirit. We're not individuals. That's an illusion. And finding our way back to that presence in the Great Spirit is the key to that spiritual evolution.
But I would say, like, when you really do find your way back to the place you've never left, you realize that's who you are, then yeah, you're not an individual, and you also are an individual. I don't think it's an either-or premise here. Like, the relative and the absolute are no different than if you take a lens, a concave and a convex lens is the same lens. You turn it one way, it's convex. You turn it the other way, it's concave. But the reality that we're talking about is absolutely infinite and inclusive, and everything is within that reality. So to say that the idea of being an individual, well, the idea, of course, is illusory, but the reality is you are both an individual and you are not an individual. And I know that the mind hates that, the human kind of conceptual framework loves to define things, and this is black and this is white, this is absolute, this is relative, this is good, this is bad. But the reality that we're pointing to here is beyond all dichotomies like that. It's beyond personal and impersonal. It's beyond, it's one reality. So personal and impersonal are included in it together. They're all, does that make sense? It's, and it's also one of those things that until we see this, until we actually have a direct experience of it, talking about it is philosophy. And it's just, it's not it. It's okay, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it, but it's just talking. It's just concepts, but when we have a direct experience of it, then it informs our whole life and transforms our life. Because it's truth. It's living truth. It's not just an abstract idea in the head.
Yeah. So when you die, you still are. But what happens to your knowingness or that when you die, you personally?
Well, I don't think I'm dead. So see me in about 30 or 40 years and ask me then, oh, I'll be dead, so get a Ouija board.
But you're identifying with everything, with being. So when your body goes, that identification is still there.
Well, on one level, I am this body. I am this body temporarily. This body is that we call Francis, that goes by that name and has a certain history and was born at a certain time and all that. And I don't have any trouble with that. I like the guy, he's okay. But it's not ultimately who I am. It's not like absolutely who I am. Who I am absolutely is this simple sense of presence that's beyond Francis. There might have been other lifetimes. In fact, I'm quite sure there were when this consciousness was seen to be somehow connected in some intimate way to some other body in some other name, and they passed away. But the presence is not. There's not like separate presences. It's not like I have a presence, Rick has a presence, you have a presence, he has a presence, she has a presence. There's one presence. And it's taking all these different forms that are constantly coming, going. That's my sense of it. Now, what happens after I die, to be completely honest with you, I cannot tell you. Because I haven't died yet, at least this time around. So, and I don't really have a real clear memory of what it was like before. So, it's one of those questions. The Buddha used to say, people would ask Buddha, different theoretical questions, what happens to the enlightened one after death, what happens here, what happens there, is there a heaven, is there a hell, and the Buddha would say, this is a question, and I'm not trying to put down your question, but this is the Buddha's response to such things is, this is a question that does not lead to edification. That's what the polytexts say. But I think what he's saying is, this is philosophy, this is theory, this is concepts, and fine, have fun with it. Talk about it all you want, philosophize, form coffee clutches and discuss it. But it's not really going to lead to awakening, and there's no way of really knowing, is there? Because none of us here are dead, I don't think. Oh, no, they're asleep, I'm sorry. No, but I mean, none of us is dead, so, you know, my answer to a lot of that stuff is, you know, what happens to you, if you're enlightened, what happens to an enlightened person after they die? And one person asked me that, and I said, I don't know. Get enlightened and then die, and then let me know. Get back with me on that, you know? Because that's the only way to know, really. Does that make sense? I guess
well,
what
it's the same answer I've got friends of mine who are awake and have answered exactly the same way.
Yeah, I mean, there's no, you know, like, the thing that happens when you really wake up is what you realize is you don't know too much. You know, I know a few things, and this I know. You know, when I was a little kid, I used to sing the song, Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. You know, and that's about all I knew back then. And now it's kind of returned to that. I don't, not Jesus loves me necessarily, but just I know that what I am on the deepest level is this presence, and that's about all I know. And I really don't know a lot more than that. But that's kind of enough. It's pretty wonderful to know that. And when I say know, I mean directly experience it. Directly know it, not just believe it. You know, and that's what we're so used to as human beings, is beliefs. Having all kinds of beliefs about God, about life, about who I am, about who you are, or who I'm not and who you're not, and so on. And yet, beliefs, while they may be comforting, they may, you know, help us feel more security and stuff, they don't really transform us. Because beliefs are not living realities, they're just beliefs. And beliefs change over the years, you know. What I believed when I was 5, I believe a lot differently now. But what I'm trying to point to here is a knowing. You know, in Hindu parlance, they talk about jnana, knowledge. But that's not intellectual knowledge. That's a knowing on a very deep level. And they talk about jnanis is a person who knows. It's a knower of truth. But not a knower of truth in an abstract intellectual way, but someone who knows that they know that they know. Because they know what they see. You know? And I'm not even saying that questions like that can't be asked. I mean, sure, ask them all you want, but you see what I'm saying? There's really no real answer to questions like that, because they're kind of on a level of theory and conjecture and, you know, that kind of thing. And until you really experience something, you can't really know it. You can believe all kinds of things about it. You can believe, I believe this is what happens after you die. I believe this is what happens after an enlightened one dies. I believe, I believe, I believe. But until we die, we don't know. So, yeah.
What in your experience makes one person more receptive to this experience than another person?
I don't know. Again, there it is. I don't know a whole lot. Well, I think, you know, really, each individual human being on that level that we are individual human beings is so unique and has who knows how many lifetimes behind them and all kinds of karma and all kinds of things they've done or not done. And so we're all at different points in the journey, aren't we? And, you know, it's one of those things, kind of like I was saying about getting to be 6 foot tall. You get there when you get there. Or maybe you don't get there. You know? But this, at least we can be sure that everyone, everything that exists, eventually will get there. Which is a wonderful thought. It's a wonderful realization that, you know, eventually, obviously, everything that exists has to do that return movement and understand who they really are and what they really are. And that's just inevitable. But when that unfolds for each person, I mean, when a person wakes up, all awakened people experience the same reality, but the path to that and the way that manifests in them also, by the way, is different from person to person. You know? And there's no way of knowing, really, you know, why did this person wake up when they were 15 years old, laid in their uncle's study and pretended they were dead, and they woke up and they were this, you know, totally realized person that radiated this presence. And then another person didn't wake up till they were 90 years old on their deathbed. And then another person never woke up in this life. Maybe they woke up in the next life or the next one or the next one. You know, it's very enigmatic, kind of unknowable, you know. See what I'm saying? It's really, I mean, it's kind of an interesting question, but we can't know.
Do you think when you had this experience, there was something that was a constellation around that, or something that was going on that made that more viable at that point? Or,
I don't know.
yeah.
I mean, you know, I certainly had done a lot of practice my whole life. And I was doing very intense practice at the time this occurred. But one thing I would say too is this, and this might be difficult to kind of convey, but this is not an experience even. I mean, experiences come and go, don't they? And we have a plethora of experiences in one human life. You know, think back and try to count every experience you ever had, just since yesterday, maybe even. It's endless, isn't it? I mean, in each moment, there's all kinds of experiences arising, sensory experiences, psychological, spiritual. And it's really difficult to even comprehend, you know, how many experiences, just endless. We've had infinite almost. And yet what I'm kind of pointing to here is the discovery of that in which every experience arises and ceases. It's that consciousness, that presence, that vast, spacious openness in which everything comes and goes. It's the uncovering of that, which has always been here and now. It is here and now. It's always here and now. So, do you see the distinction there? That that's not really an experience, it's the ground of all experience. And somebody back there, and then I'll come there. Back there.
Did you experience like an ego death or fear of not existing, like any challenges? Anything like that?
Well, I mean, in the moment that this presence, this sense of presence really struck me very clearly, at that same instant, the realization that that's what I am was very clear. So all the other conceptual ideas of who or what I am kind of just fell away. You know, and I think that's what the ego, what we call the ego, is like a self-concept. It's a kind of, it's a conceptual self that we take to be real. You know, so we bundle together all these experiences that this body has had in a lifetime, and then we say, okay, I was born here by these parents, I was raised in this town, I went to this school, I married this person, I had this job, and on and on and on. And then we bundle that all together and we say, okay, that's me. That's the concept of me. And we take that to be real. But what happens when this is uncovered is we realize that what we really are is just this immediate sense of presence here and now. And all that stuff that happened to this body, it's all gone. It's not living and active in right now.
So the identification shifted somehow from it just.
That's one way to put it. Identification shifted, or maybe you could say identification was dropped. Because how can you identify with the present moment that's here and now? There's really nothing solid to hold on to. It's just this, right now, right here. There's nothing, there's no concept, there's no structure really in one way to hold on to. Now in another sense, you are this body that experienced this and experienced that on a relative level. That's still who you are. That's when you look at me. This is Francis. He was a monk. He did this. He looks this way. He's this age. He's this sex, whatever. Okay, that's fine. And I don't have any trouble with that. That's fine. That's how I move through the world. That's, you know. But I realize that that's not really who I am on the deepest level. That's not to negate it and say it doesn't matter at all. It's relatively important. It's not absolutely important. So there is an identification shift, maybe from identification to not having identification on one level. Does that make sense?
And so what's there to fear about that? If you're not existing as, you know,
I think before that happened, there were moments of fear around that, because I think somehow when you're on the verge of that happening, there's a kind of knowing of that on some level, and even in ego kind of, there's a real strong ego identification. We're talking about the ego now like it's a real entity, which it's not, but it's just for the terms, the purpose of the conversation. The ego kind of knows it's on its way out. You know, it's like, oh, the jig's up. And it kind of gets that, because it's not like it just falls away completely in one swoop. It's like it gets weaker and weaker. It's one analogy I've used, it's like a glacier on the side of a mountain, and a little piece of the glacier falls off here, a little piece falls off there, and it just keeps here and there, there's little chunks of it falling off. And then what happens eventually? The whole thing goes, and it all falls off, and then the mountain's there, exposed. The true mountain, you know? And there is a moment in which the entire glacier kind of falls and it finishes off the job. But until then, there's little pieces of it falling already. So if the glacier had a kind of consciousness like that, it would maybe think, ooh, you know, ooh, that part fell off, that part, ooh, this is getting a little hairy here, you know. Ooh, the middle part fell off, oh. And then one day it's all gone. So, does that make sense?
well, is there an easy way out?
Is there an easy way out? Is that what you said? Heavy drugs. No, I don't think there's an easy way out.
It's like dropping habits,
Dropping identification when that happens. You know, it's like, you know, I mean, Nisargadatta, who was a very highly enlightened guy in Bombay, and smoked. So their bodies still had this habit of smoking. And I remember somebody just, John Loyne, who I've been spending the weekend with, and he said recently, the other day, I think it was him, and he said, some lady said to Nisargadatta, oh, it seems that you're very attached to smoking. And he said, oh, it seems you're very attached to not smoking. And I'm not saying you should go out and smoke like Nisargadatta, but I'm just saying that even though there's no identification anymore with the personality, let's say, with habits and things, there is still a personality structure that's there. It's just the identification with it has dropped. But that's not, I mean, like if you get to know me, Francis, you'll see there's a personality that's still fully functional here. I would say a strong personality. But there's not any big identification with it on an absolute level. I mean, there's a relative identification. There's like a sense that, yeah, that's who Francis is. He prefers this. He likes pizza. He likes vanilla ice cream, blah, 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 you know. But then there's no harm in that. But there is a sense in which the really serious identification with that falls away. But there's no easy way to that because we really cling to that, don't we? I mean, that's who I am. That's what I'm about. That's who I am. It was so funny when I left the monastery and I was looking for a job, and I went into this one interview, and this guy, like he's interviewing me, you know, and he sits back in his chair and he puts his arms back and he goes, "So, who is Francis Bennett?" And I go, And I sat there and I thought, boy, did you ask an interesting one. And I didn't go into a non-dual spiel. I just said, I presume you're talking about what I've experienced in my life and education. He goes, well, sure, that's what I'm talking about. Okay. And I told him who that guy was. But while I told him, I wasn't, it's like when you play a part in a play. I was in plays a lot in high school and college and stuff. And I don't know why, but I love this, to use Fiddler on the Roof as an example. But I was in Fiddler on the Roof, but I wasn't Tevye. I was the Goyen philosopher. Fell in love with the daughter, But anyway, Tevye, is the father, if I were a rich man. But, if you were playing Tevye in a play, you wouldn't feel conflicted that your family was going to be exiled to Siberia that night when you went home and had your pizza with your wife. You'd realize, oh, that's my role in the play. I don't need to be concerned about that. I mean, when you're on stage and you're playing the role, you take it seriously. You take your cues, you sing your songs when it's time to sing the songs, you remember your lines and you deliver your lines appropriately, and hopefully with conviction, and people enjoy your performance, and it's all fine. It's all good. But you're not conflicted over the conflicts of Tevye. But even when you are playing the part on stage, if Tevye is conflicted, what do? You're conflicted. There, you do that role. And I think even awakened people, they can, when their wife dies or their husband dies, they cry. They're sad. They feel sad. Of course. But that's not to say there's any big, deep, there's no absolute identification with that. I don't know if that makes sense to you, but I'm just trying to give a flavor of this.
Yeah, but I guess the shift, I think the challenge for me and it's just that clinging on. You know that we've had, different experiences of being around us. But there's this really, clinging.
Yeah. But what I'm talking about isn't an experience of presence. It's the realization that that presence is what you are. It's the direct realization of that, the direct seeing of that, the direct knowing of that somehow, that's what you are, and it's not just an experience. Does that make sense? But it's on a different level than experience.
So we have glimpses.
Yeah. But like when you have this sense of knowing that that's what you are, in a way that doesn't leave, because it can't leave. The very nature of it is that it's always been here and always will be eternally here. So once that realization is there, then all that stuff seems like so much dross. It's not, it doesn't really feel so real.
It's freedom. It sounds like freedom to me.
It's very free. Yeah.
And so I guess maybe there's no answers.
Yeah, it's like one of those things like, what does an orange taste like until you taste it? You can try to describe it, and I think the description, in one sense, it does point, and maybe just one little description in a certain way, in a certain word that speaks to that person, and it may tip them over the edge, and they may get that in that moment. And that's kind of the way it happens. The Zen tradition, you hear all these stories about a Zen monk was out breaking leaves, and a tile from the roof falls and smacks on the ground, and he's enlightened. He suddenly gets, and it's sort of like, I suspect probably when things like that happen, it's like they realize the immediacy of this moment suddenly, and then they're on that level, and then they get it. They realize that, yeah, that's all there is. That's all there is. That's all there ever has been. Not even it's not the particular unfolding in that now, but it's the now itself. It's like, that's who I am. They get it, they see it on that level, on that really deep level of realization, which again I say, is not an experience. you know, because a lot of you guys are meditators and done all kinds of spiritual things, and you know, I'm sure, there are many experiences to be had, aren't there? Of even relative bliss and light and insight and joy and love and all these things, and they come and they go. But what I'm pointing to is not, it's beyond experience. It's the ground of all experiences, that in which every experience appears. I don't know if that makes sense or resonates, but that's the only way I can put it, really. Now, what time are we supposed to?
I don't think we have a deadline or anything.
We don't have.
Unless Joel, no, we're cool, so just.
Okay, well, I'll just, if people have more questions, we'll just, yeah.
I have a non-philosophical question.
Good. Not that we've had so many, and I don't mind them either, so.
So as a Trappist monk, how was it you were able to study with Zen masters and do these various practices? Because I would think that you'd be pretty much regimented within your monastery about what you were allowed to do.
Well, the Trappists are the order that, I don't know if you are all familiar with it, but Thomas Merton was a Trappist monk at the monastery of my profession, Yosemite. And he kind of blazed a trail there where he explored various other traditions like Zen and Advaita and Tibetan Buddhism, various paths, and kind of did a lot of, sort of as a spiritual explorer, you could say, or just like checking out these various traditions. And when I was in the Trappists, I entered in the early 80s, at the age of 22, and a lot of, especially the younger of us, were interested in various other traditions, and it was a contemplative monastery set up to facilitate an experience of God, or realization of God, God realization, whatever you want to say. And I think the Trappists in general were fairly progressive in the sense that many of the abbots and various Trappist monks, were open to the exploration of other traditions, much more than you would think. It wasn't so narrow. There are other religious orders that are a little more narrow and more sort of restrictive and wouldn't probably be open to that, but the Trappists were pretty open to that. And a lot of Trappists studied TM. There were a number of Trappists that studied TM, came here, or TM teachers came to their monasteries and taught them. In the, I'd say, late 60s, early 70s, that was happening among the Trappists. Does that answer your question? Yeah?
Yeah, just maybe people could stand up also if they don't mind, so that everybody can hear the question.
I just wanted to say, I really love the thing you said early on about the quagmire of human conditioning. Because I came in here kind of deep in it, and I had a really, really rough time. I've been kind of feuding with my sister. We've been sending emails back and forth, and I got a really harsh one from her. And I spent 2 hours writing nonstop to my sister this afternoon. And I was so deep in the quagmire of human conditioning. And I felt worse than I had in a really long time. I was immersed in it. And I kind of dragged myself over here, like feeling bad. And when you said that phrase, I recognized where I was. And then, like, either right before that or right after that, you were saying, how did you say it? Just, your experience was that there was just presence. And I realized that, I mean, I just was kind of filled with bliss because it's like, we have this complete control. We can step out of the quagmire if we're kind of, I don't know, willing to or something. I mean, I stepped out of it. And not that I was enlightened, but I stepped out of the quagmire. And
it's a little enlightenment there.
And yes, it is. It is. And I feel like, do you think that a path, there could be like a path to the kind of self-realization that we want, which is just kind of making a habit of choosing when you see that you're immersed in your own, you know, welter of personality and beliefs and attachments, and you just feel the pain of that and restriction of that. And when you see it, if you can just realize that you do have that choice to say, no, I don't need to live that life. I can be free in this moment by simply dropping that.
Yeah.
I mean, forget my sister. Who cares? She's 1,000 miles away. Why am I putting myself through grief? I feel like my life is kind of being crushed by the lack of love that I can't get out of her, and I need it, or just support, validation. It's like my ego is crushing my bliss by swelling up and filling, taking up all the space, and that's the quagmire. That's the quagmire. It's just like the whole pain of ego. But, that makes it sound like, well, there's a path and you can, just do these steps or something. But I just want to say this one other thing that is in my head about this too, which is that I'm a book editor and I worked years ago on this book, like 7 years ago, on this book by Sailor Bob Adamson. I don't know if you know him.
I know who he is.
He wrote this book, yeah, and this was, this was not his book, it was a book about him, kind of. And I kept reading that he said his teaching was, just stop thinking. Just stop. Just stop thinking. And I was completely frustrated. It's like, I'm sorry. The thoughts keep coming. It didn't work. But you know where it works for me is when I say, just step out of the quagmire. Just stop those thoughts. Just step out of the hell of ego by simply dropping the thought of it.
I wouldn't even say stop thinking, or I wouldn't say that. I would say almost just let the thought be. Understand that it's just a thought. It's not real. I don't have to attach to it. I don't have to believe it. It's just a thought. It's no different than watching a cloud go by the sky. You can't make the cloud go away, but you can understand that it's just a cloud. It's just coming and going. And I don't have to identify with it. I don't have to take it so seriously. I can just let it come, and it'll be there a while, and like everything that comes, it'll go. And then what remains is that happiness, that peace, that presence. Because that's what's always here. This other stuff, it's just a temporary guest. It just comes and visits, and then it's gone.
Cloud.
Yeah.
On your heart. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
It's really beautiful what you're saying.
Thank you. And it's, did you feel that? Could you feel that energetically, like what she was expressing? It was that joy, that freedom. It's like a freedom. And it's already present in all of us. It's just covered up with this stuff that we hold on to. And it is really simple. All we got to do is just allow that stuff to just come and go, because that's what it does anyway. That's the nature of it, of all relative reality, of all objects, whether they're psychological, physical, whatever they are, they come, they're here a while, and they go. And when they're gone, what you really are is still present.
Can I also say, do you have the sense that you could lose the awareness that you have? I know you said before you aren't all of a sudden going to think you're a giraffe.
Pardon me?
You said you aren't all of a sudden going to think you're a giraffe. But I had sort of a higher plane of life for a little while, but I lost it, like years ago. And it's more ordinary now. And so do you think it can come and go? And do you think that you could lose what you have, or you know that you're established in something that is unchanging? And you won't cloud up and lose touch with it.
Well, I haven't lost touch with it so far. And the very nature of it is that it's eternally present. So, that's one of those questions too. It's like, what do you say? Yeah.
I have a question about the role of addictions and attachments. So like you were talking about the cigarette smoking. So addictions and attachments can still exist simultaneously along with the presence, as long as there's not an identification. But they'll still exist, the addictions and the attachments. Is that correct?
Yes and no. I would say that it's a possible that a person, well, what we're talking about awakening to is the source of all human is the source of perfect happiness. So what is an addiction?
Well, what if someone's happy with their addiction and attachment?
That's like kind of saying like, what if a person's happy with their headache? I mean, there's a phase of addiction where you think it's going to make you happy, and there's a phase of it when you realize that it's not going to work. I never had a major addiction like drugs or alcohol or smoking or anything like that. So I cannot speak to that from my own personal direct experience. I do, however, have a brother who went through a deep addiction for many years. So I have some experience of it in that sense. But my own sense in talking also to many people who've been addicted for many years, I've talked to a number of people in that situation. And my own sense is that addiction of any kind, and I think every human being is addicted in one way or another. Some addictions are more socially acceptable than others, but I think everybody's looking for happiness in some activity or some object, or I think that's kind of essentially what addiction is about. It's like thinking that if I get this object, if I get this activity, if I do this activity, it will bring me happiness, it will bring me peace, it will bring me relief, I'll somehow find the joy that I'm seeking. And I think what I'm talking about, what I'm trying to point to here, is the discovery of the source of perfect happiness. So my question would be, if you've awakened to that, why would you still feel the need to find that in something else? Now, Nisargadatta smoking, I'm not so sure at that point, if you really looked at his experience of that would be seen as an addiction exactly. I mean, it was an activity that the body was still doing, and it was harmful, but it was still happening. It'd be hard to kind of really figure that out completely, but I would think that awakening on some level would normally, eventually anyway, lead to the letting go of this search for happiness in these other forms. So I don't know if that speaks to what you're saying. I can honestly say that I do not have direct personal experience with addiction on that level, that kind of addiction that you're talking about, I presume. So I don't feel really qualified to go into that, but I would say what I just said, that this is a kind of awakening to the source of all happiness. And so then why would there be a need? It would just be a question I would have if somebody was saying, oh, I've awoken to this source to realize that I am this happiness that I've been seeking, but I'm still going to do this because I think it will make me happy. It kind of doesn't really exactly make sense.
I mean, when we think about full enlightenment, it's without the attachments where there's total bliss. And what we've known is that there isn't those attachments to be enlightened, that they all leave. Do you have anything to say about that? In terms of enlightenment and losing the attachment?
Just what I just said, I think, that, you've discovered in this reality that we call enlightenment, you've discovered the source of all happiness. You've discovered the source of perfect happiness. It doesn't have a shade of sadness in it. So then why would there be a felt need to find that in some object after that? At least eventually. Now, there is a kind of integration process, I think, that we have to be sort of real about. That a lot of people get an insight. It's possible to get an insight into something, and then it may take some linear time to actually embody that fully and really let that, like the trickle-down effect, you could say, of it. Does that make sense? So in that sense, there could be a letting go of things even after an awakening. Although I think there are different levels of this, and I think when the awakening is really, really deep and profound and stable, a lot of this stuff does just fall away. I mean, that's all I can speak to from my own experience, but there are many, many levels of this. So I think a person could maybe have a kind of awakening that maybe was a little less profound than that I'm pointing to. And maybe there could still be residual conditioning left. And there certainly is conditioning left that needs to kind of be worked out gradually over time. It's a lot like, I've used an analogy before, if you had a glass full of muddy water, and you weren't putting any more muddy water into it, you'd stopped putting muddy water into it, but you were pouring clean water into it, what would happen? The clean water would come in, and the muddy water would gradually, little by little, it would work itself out. The clean water would force the muddy water out eventually, and then eventually you'd have a glass of crystal clear, clean water. Does that make sense as an analogy? Kind of? That there are certain levels of awakening that when they happen, there's still residual conditioning left, but the very nature of the pure water of awakening cleans out those vasanas, those obstructions, those attachments. They gradually work themselves out. Now there is another kind of a level of awakening that you can almost liken to a bucket of clear water. Like say you had a glass this big filled with muddy water, and you had a bucket this big filled with clean water, and you went maybe that's another analogy, but the clean water would just force the muddy water out, and all there'd be is clean water in the little glass. So that, I'm trying to just make an analogy that you can see at the different levels. There are many levels of awakening, I'm quite convinced. There are many, many levels. And some lesser levels, some weaker levels, don't automatically get rid of all the conditioning. And most people, and myself included, had many lower level awakenings and openings for many, 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 many years. And then there was like the glacier image again, of a little chunk falling here, a chunk falling there, a chunk falling there, and then one day, the whole thing falls. So I don't know if do those analogies help? Yeah.
I was going to say, with drugs and alcohol also, it would perhaps cloud your perception and ability to experience that subtleness of awareness, presence. So,
yeah.
In that sense, it could be.
Oh yeah, surely it would.
Because you talked about you're still in attachment. If your wife dies or your child dies or something, you cry. That's certain, because you're still in a body, isn't it?
Yeah, that doesn't necessarily mean there's an attachment, though. I mean, you can respond appropriately to some human situation, and maybe on some level, there's on a kind of physical level, on a kind of emotional level, there might be, and then on a deeper level of being, there's no sense of attachment. There's a sense that, yeah, that's what's going to happen. Wives die, children grow up and leave, and things come to an end in this life.
And sadness comes and it goes.
And it's the realization that that's the way it is, and that's inevitable. It's not, it can't not be that way. And there's an acceptance of that. There's a surrender to that. There's a sense that that's just the way it is.
Did you find that all fear fell away immediately with this main realization you had?
Again, I would say like identification with fear falls away. But I would say the person that really has awakened to this absolute sense of presence still can have the whole gamut of human emotions can still arise, but there's a different experience of that. Does that make sense? In other words, those are not seen as absolutely important or absolutely real, but they're seen as what they are. They're an emotion that's arising in the moment, and there's no strong sense of identification with it anymore. But I would say a large portion of fear certainly falls away. A lot of the kind of real
Well, Nisargadatta always claims that that's sort of his acid test for enlightenment that he experienced, was that fear and desire fell away. But it's, you know, how to understand that in practice, that's why I asked, you know. And, and what you say makes sense.
I mean, there's no fear, like, a lot of times people have fear of things happening, like, I could get sick, I could die, I could lose my job, I'd be poor, I'd have no money, I would say things like that pretty much fall away because the person has a sense that life just unfolds the way it unfolds, and it's all perfect just the way it is. And that's not to say we don't do anything to make things better either. That's not to say when you have a headache, you don't take an aspirin. Or when you're sick, you don't go to the doctor. Or when you don't have a job, you look for a job. Okay, but you don't have a sense of, oh my gosh, what if I don't find a job? It's like, if I don't find a job, then that means I don't find a job. What comes with this too is a kind of surrender, a surrender into the moment. That, you know, but the thing that I shy away from is making all kinds of claims, you know, that, oh, I'm so different than you. I'm so, you know, I think really in one sense there's still just a human being here that has all the human emotions and feelings and experiences that any human being has, but there's a really different relationship to those. There's a different perception of those. But I think people get into a little trouble when they start saying, oh, once you've seen the absolute reality, you're no longer a human being on some, you know, that there's a level in which you transcend being a human being. It's like, well, yes and no. And that's more and more my answer to a lot of things. I'm no more a either or guy, I'm a both and guy. I more and more see that there's not it's not either or, it's not this way or that way. It's, you know, reality is very multi-leveled. And even when you see reality on this very deep level, it doesn't mean that the lower levels suddenly disappear forever and they're just completely gone. It means that you look at them differently. Just like if you're going up in a building, you go to the first floor, you go to the second floor, you go to the third floor, you go to the fourth floor, you go to the roof. You know, the different levels that you get to don't negate the lower levels. They build upon them. They expand them. They extend them. But they're included still. You see what I'm saying? They're still included. They're not obliterated. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's...
Well, in that regard, I wonder if you have more insight after your experience with the problem that happens in many spiritual communities in America where the abbot or the yogi goes astray. Sleeping with his students becomes an alcoholic. And there are huge lists of things like this, and it's puzzling, but I wonder if you have better insight into how that could be possible.
I don't. I just honestly don't. And I puzzle about that. Sometimes I hear different things happening and, you know, and you think, oh, this person was profoundly awake and enlightened or whatever, and then they do something like that, and I don't have an answer for that. I don't really understand that. Just being honest. Yeah?
I read a book that this cow was dancing, and you know that it was criticized, and so the cow said, "Well, if I'm doing it, it must be right." So I imagine that some people, you know, in high places, think if I'm doing it, it must be right.
You know, all I can think of, like what comes to me when this kind of conversation comes up, is that something Jesus said, he said, by their fruits you will know them. And I always come back to that. It's like that idea of Christ-likeness, that idea of presence, of divinity, you know that when you see it. And when you don't see it, you know that too. Like when it's not present, that's clear. Okay, this is human ego, this is human grasping, this is human selfishness, and so on. And you know, that can manifest through all kinds of people that we may have thought all kinds of things about, and maybe we were wrong, or maybe we weren't wrong, and maybe that's just what, you know, like I say, I really have no problem just saying I don't know something anymore. And there's more I don't know than that I know. I know a few things, and that's it. And then a lot of things I don't know the answer to. Yeah.
One awareness I think that's important that everyone should have in general is that we live in a very, very toxic environment. And the toxins that we're exposed to on a daily basis in our food, in our medications, in our total environment influences. And learning to limit the amount of influence by these toxins is extremely important. Whether it's caffeine, whether it's a drug you're taking, it doesn't really matter. Whether it's the food you're eating. And learning to have a life that is extremely simple, nutritionally, environmentally, in your daily schedule, which includes the sleep cycle especially, are extremely important things for us to become familiar with regard to us individually, and select the things that allows us to be the most balanced, the most in touch with our universal presence, with our God consciousness.
I don't know.
Oh, I was going to say I don't know. Yeah, I was going to say perhaps. Does anybody? I notice a lot of people are leaving, so maybe we should call it a night. It's 9 o'clock. Does that seem? What do you think?
Sure. Is there any more questions?
Thank you all very much for coming, and even for me this was like a very, very simple night, but I just gave you what I had, so hopefully it helped somebody. So.
Thank you very much for what you've
Thank
given.
you.